Let's talk about the shadow. What is it? Why we try to avoid it? And how, if we don't make it conscious, it basically runs our lives every day. This is Corinne Blum, and you're listening to Raw Conversations. So, what is the shadow? There are various interpretations of what it is. I think sometimes the misperception of it is that it's the negative parts of us. And I personally try to stay clear of the words positive and negative because, in my opinion, the way that I look at this is it automatically creates a kind of judgment. This is a good part of me, this is a bad part of me. And I believe that there are no bad parts. There are just parts that need our loving attention. And they need our awareness so that we can give them what they need. And through our loving attention, we can transmute them. We can transform and evolve them. So the shadow to me are just the parts of us that we don't want to look at. That's why they're in the shadow. You know, they're dark to us, not because they're negative and bad, but because we don't want to look at them. Because ultimately, the reason why we don't want to look at them is because they hurt. There are pain, there are wounding, and we aren't really all that good at being with discomfort, at sitting with our pain. We live in a society that is very quick to want to numb, distract, transcend even. You know, I see that even in the spiritual community. There's the transcending of something. Whereas in my practice, I've found, again, this is my experience and my opinion, I found that being with these aspects of ourselves is the quickest way to actually transmute them. It's in the either trying to transcend or ignore and deflect where we get stuck in that and it becomes part of our unconscious habitual nature. And I'll get to that point a little bit later. So really what the shadow is just the parts of us that are hurt, that feel pain, and that we don't want to look at because it feels too scary to look at them. And on that note, I think there's something really powerful. This actually came up with a client in a session, and it's actually come up in many, many different sessions, to be honest. When we can come to the real just truth and vulnerability of, I'm scared. This scares me. Which is kind of actually different than just naming our fears, because naming our fears can still be somewhat abstract or kind of one step removed where we're looking at what our fears are, which is great, by the way. I think that's a really, really valuable process. But we're kind of going, yes, I'm afraid of this and I'm afraid of that. But when we actually get to the point where we're in something, we might be triggered by something, we might be in the process of looking at things that scare us or things that cause us anxiety or that trigger us. But in that moment we go, wow, what's actually going on for me is I'm scared. That's so powerful because it's so honest. And I find that when we're really honest with ourselves, it's actually very simple. That's why I say, you know, we're a little bit walking paradoxes, because on one hand, it can seem like we're really complicated. But on the other hand, we're really simple because actually most of the time, the things that are triggering us are just triggering the fact that we feel really scared and vulnerable in that moment. And really what we're needing is love. That's why it's simple. The process, the journey, the work might feel hard because we're not used to it. And we're having to really face and confront ourselves. And that can sometimes feel overwhelming or, you know, that like there's so much to look at and so much to deal with. But actually, if you really strip it down, often it's that we're scared and we need love. And fear can also, you know, being scared can also come into the parts of us that feel shame. And so with the shadow, a lot of the time, shame can arise because it's the part of ourselves that we don't want to look at because we believe that they're bad. We believe that they're ugly. We're ashamed of those parts of ourselves. And again, in a society that is constantly telling us that we're not good enough and that we need to be better. And the ways that we need to be better are actually kind of shit, right? Like, oh, here, if you make lots of money, if you're really successful, if you're really famous, if you're, you have a certain status. But a lot of these things are illusionary, and then you get there and even I've listened to gold medalists, Olympic gold medalists that, work their entire lives to get this medal, and then it happens, and then after they go into a deep state of depression because it's like, oh, well, I got the trophy, but I still feel empty, right? Or I feel even more empty because now what? Now what am I going to do? And as a performing artist, I remember this kind of the ebb and flow of creativity where you're working on this extreme high, of creating a project, the months, sometimes years, depending, you could be working on a film project that literally takes years, and this kind of high that is created, this momentum that is created, and then you get to the climax and you produce it and it's performed or it's released if it's a film, and then there's the come down, and then there's the woof, the release after. And I remember I would have this amazing high if I was performing, or if I'd choreographed a piece, or if I was doing a play. And then after this, the decompression. And those are really honest moments, because there's two sides to it. One is like, yes, you're creating this beautiful thing and it is really genuine and authentic. And the coming off of it is just even what's happening with the dopamine release. And then the come down after. But if there's any kind of attachment to when I do this and when I succeed and when I put something out there, therefore then I will be good enough. My worth is dependent on what I do and what I produce and what I achieve. And then on the other side of that is like, well, I'm not doing that. So, oh, wow, where did my self-worth go? Right? So I've talked about this before, so I won't go too deeply into it now, but when we associate our worth with what we do, it's fleeting and it's very codependent. And it can change, right? It can go up and down in an instant depending on what you're doing, and if what you're doing is being received positively or negatively. In this sense, I will use those words, because do people like it? Do people not like it? And actually, it should really be more about what we do in the world is the expression of who we authentically are. It's a joyful expression. Even if the expression comes through suffering, it's still at the end, it's joyful because it's authentic. And that feels good for us to share authentically, to be who we really are. But it's not dependent on the reaction. Does that make sense? So coming back to the shadow and what it is, and let's move into actually why we avoid it. We avoid it because of the shame. We avoid it because it hurts and because it's uncomfortable and because what we believe it to be, it's like we create this whole picture and this story that it's so terrible or it's so hard to look at. It'll be so painful or so scary, like terrifying, or it's so shameful that we avoid it because it feels like too much. And that's why actually it's really freaking helpful to be guided through it, to be supported. This idea that we have to do it totally on our own is false. Do we have to go in and do the inner work, and ultimately is it up to us to create this change? Absolutely. Absolutely. There is no pill for this. There's no one that's going to fix it for you, because there's actually essentially nothing to fix because you're not broken. There's nothing to get rid of because you can't just go in and you don't want to go in and cut your arm off metaphorically, right? That's not how we get better. We don't get rid of things. We transmute them. And why it's up to you is because you are the one that you're looking for. You are the one that's ultimately going to create the change within you, because it comes down to, it boils down to your relationship with yourself. It might be triggered by the relationship you had with your mother or your father or your siblings or your peers, because of whatever trauma might have gone on there, trauma or drama. But at the end of the day, it's your approval. It's your love that you're seeking, because of course you might seek love and approval from others, but it's still going to always be one step removed, right? Because if we don't feel it and embody it and believe it within ourselves, someone can love us abundantly and we still go, I don't believe you. I don't trust it. The other stuff will come up. The underlying shadow will come up. And what the shadow does, I was watching the documentary Stutz by Jonah Hill. And it's a documentary about his therapist, Phil Stutz. And there's some brilliant things in there. And what he's talking about is, when we don't face our shadow, it basically runs us. Because the shadow is also what you could say is unconscious. We're not conscious of it. And so we're, by nature, habitual creatures. And a lot of our, you could say we're kind of programmed within the first 7 years of our life, sometimes even before that, but the 7 years is the first kind of cellular cycle. And in that time, we might have certain experiences that hurt us, pained us, confused us, left us feeling alone, rejected, abandoned. It's like, here, welcome to being human. We all have this. It doesn't matter what kind of a childhood we had. We all have some kind of story wherein we had a moment where we felt hurt. And so when that pain comes in or that wound comes in, we create a story and we create beliefs that match that story. And until we make them conscious, they run our lives. We're not aware of them because that's the whole point. They're unconscious. They're in the shadows. And so the point of doing the work is you bring the shadow into the light and you make it conscious. You become aware of what's going on. And getting to the third point, which is if you don't make it aware, it runs your life. It just will. You're functioning from your limiting beliefs, firstly, of who you are, and your limiting beliefs paint the perspective of your life. It's like having a tinted lens. Instead of seeing life clearly and as objectively as possible. It's impossible to be purely objective because we have opinions and thoughts and feelings. But as long as they're not so tinted, like looking through the lens of my belief will create a different color, right? My limiting belief might be I see red. Everything is red, when actually you want to see things for the color that they are, right? You want to see that the tree is green and the sky is blue and, the color, the flowers are a multitude of different colors. But if I'm looking through a particular lens, everything will be red, for example. Everything. Let's say that lens is I'm not good enough, or I'm not lovable, I'm not worthy, I'm not significant enough, I'm not competent, right? People reject me, men abandon me, women don't approve of me. Whatever it is, that's the way that we perceive life. And that's the unconscious aspect, but those patterns will be running the show all the time. So the thing is that the shadow is the part of us that is most scared. And so really the act of transmuting it is we have to turn towards our pain, towards our fear, and we have to be with them. We have to sit with them with love, and we actually really need to listen. We need to listen to what they have to say. Why? This is the thing. There's always a reason for our behavior. Always. We might not like a behavior because we go, well, that's not really all that helpful. It's not that useful. Or in kind of terms that people use a lot, it's a negative pattern. Again, I don't like that terminology, but it could be sabotaging. It could be defeating. It could be, defensive. It could be all of these things that we, again, deem as negative and we don't like. And those are the parts that we want to get rid of. But really, these parts, there's always a reason for why they are behaving the way that they're behaving. And I think this is often a step that we miss because we just go, I don't like that. How do I get rid of it? How do I get over it? How do I change it? But the reason could be it was a really good coping mechanism when you were a kid, when you were a child, because this is what we do as children. We can't quite make sense of things yet because our brain isn't even developed. And yet as children, we're highly intuitive, sensitive. We can understand things more on an emotional level, meaning we feel things. So a lot of our pain and wounding gets stored in our body, in our cellular body, in our emotional body, but we can't make sense of why. And that's why as adults, we don't need to overanalyze. I'm not from the school of thinking that you need to just analyze your story and nitpick it. And, we can overanalyze things and it doesn't actually change anything. What changes our patterns is the experience changes. And for the experience to change, we have to go into the feeling body. We have to go into the emotional body. We have to feel the part that's like, oh, wow, I feel so ashamed of myself because I believe deep down that I'm not lovable. Like we got to sit with that and go, fuck, that really hurts. Or like, wow, that part of me feels so lonely. Like so alone with this pain and this suffering and this sadness. So, but when we have a kind of wounding, the behavior when we're little is we're really good at coping, because what choice do we have if we don't have the support from a parent? What choice do we have other than to just cope and basically survive? Because that's just going to be a basic instinct. At that point in time, we don't have the awareness and the consciousness and the tools to go, okay, I'm going to be with myself and listen to myself and give myself the loving support that I need. No, you were a child and you were scared. Or you felt hurt, or you felt rejected, or you felt abandoned, and you needed someone to fucking be there for you. And the thing is we can't even blame our parents fully, because they're just human too, and having their own kind of human crisis experience, and maybe coping and surviving because they haven't made their wounds conscious. And so we repeat the cycle over and over again. There was this woman that I was listening to, I don't know her name, unfortunately, but she had this great term that says, that she said, we pass on. I listened to this on the podcast, We Can Do Hard Things with Glennon Doyle. And my apologies that I don't remember this therapist's name, but she said, we pass on intergenerational errands. So what one generation hasn't completed or hasn't made conscious, it gets passed on to the next generation. We take on that errand. And then I think it's up to each generation to heal it, bring it to an end, right? So there's so many things going on, because there's our own personal kind of story and wounding, but a lot of it is also influenced by our parents' wounding and their parents' wounding and their parents' wounding, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot, this is where it gets complicated, because there's a lot of layers. But again, the simplicity of it is most of us are just scared because we're hurt. And what do we need? We need loving attention. So the thing is that we don't want to cope our entire lives. When we become adults, we actually do have the maturity to take care of ourselves. But what's happening is we're replaying the child's reaction to their wounding over and over again. And we're keeping things in the shadow, and we're avoiding the shadow because it feels shameful. And we're essentially abandoning and rejecting ourselves on sometimes a daily basis, because we're not wanting to not only look at ourselves, but we're really not wanting to accept our full selves. And the only way we get to self-love is by accepting all of ourselves. Every inch, every nook and cranny, and not seeing it as if there's any parts of us that are bad or negative. I just wish I could scream that, shout that out to the world, not scream, but just shout it out to the world of like, there's nothing in you that is bad and shameful. It's just a human part of you that is hurting, that needs your loving attention. That's it. Even when you look at, there's a beautiful project called the Prison, I think it's called the Prison Compassion Project, or something around there. I'll have to look it up. I'll put it in the notes. And it's, even when you look at people, these people that are on death row, right? They have a death sentence. But when you go into the details of their life, you see what their childhood was like and the level of abuse and abandonment and neglect. Again, you understand the motivation for the behavior. I mean, that's on an extreme form, right? Someone that kills someone else, that's extreme pain. That's extreme abuse. But again, you can trace it back and you can understand the reasoning for it. Doesn't mean that that's okay to do, but you understand why. And this is why I'm saying there's always a why. There's always a reason for our behavior. And I think when we can come into a place of compassion, not berating ourselves, not shaming ourselves, not putting ourselves down, but going, okay, I understand why I had to cope in this way. I understand why I become defensive. I understand why I'm scared of intimacy or vulnerability. So this whole process requires so much forgiveness, patience, compassion, tenderness, gentleness, and to see that there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with your shadow. But it really it's needing your attention. Because at the end of the day, whatever your shadow is, whatever shame that triggers in you, or fear. Again, I'm going to go back to what I said in the beginning. You could have a partner or friend or whatever, people around you that love you, that will accept you for all of who you are. That will go, yeah, I see your shadow and I still love you. I still accept you. But if you can't do that for yourself, there will always be something missing. There will always be a bit of a hole. And that's where we don't feel whole. We feel whole, not whole like whole, WHOLE, when we embrace all of us. And when we learn to show up, like maybe the shadow doesn't fully go away, we can over time alchemize it. I can say that from firsthand experience, but there might always be an element of the shadow because, again, what Phil Stutz said, which I thought was beautiful, is there's 3 aspects of life that we all need to contend with: pain, suffering, and doing the hard work. There will always be an element of pain. There will always be, it wasn't suffering, it was uncertainty. Life is a whole, it's a whole bunch of uncertainty and unknown. We don't know our future. We can just know what the next right step is, but we don't know our future. And so really, again, accepting and embracing that life is a huge unknown. How do we walk ourselves through it? How do we hold ourselves by the hand as we walk through life? How do we deal with our pain? Because it doesn't mean that we have to be in a constant state of pain and struggle and suffering, but Jesus, it doesn't go away, meaning forever. There will be ebbs and flows, right? We'll go through different cycles. Life is secular. It's cyclical. It's not linear. That's also a misconception. So there will always, we will encounter pain. We will encounter suffering. We will encounter days just like the weather, right? There are going to be days where it's cloudy and overcast or storming and thundering, and then there'll be sunny days, and there'll be some days that have some clouds. We're no different, right? We're ebbing and flowing, and the point is to not get too attached to any one state of being. And what Phil Stutz was saying is we can also really get attached to our misery. We can get attached to our depression. We can get attached to the saboteur and the critic and, all of these things that are saying, see, look, you're not good enough. You can't do anything. What's the point? We can actually get attached to that because, as I've said in the past, we're far more comfortable with what we know, what's familiar to us, even if it's not serving us, than we are with the unknown, even if the unknown would actually serve us much better. So, what do we do with all of this information? How do we practically use this? There's 2 things, and one I could feel will branch off into a different podcast, but I'm just going to mention it briefly here. We need to begin to show up in our lives as adults that have choices and free will, that we can choose how we want to live our life, how we want to engage with it, how we want to show up, how we want to take care of ourselves or not take care of ourselves. Like to get out of the victimization. Like remember, again, as a child, we didn't have the power or the ability to make choices for ourselves in our lives. But as adults, we do. But what happens is we kind of enact the wounded child that might go, no, I don't want to do that. Or I'm too scared of that, or I need somebody else, or again, something that feels such, I really recommend watch the documentary. Oh, it doesn't feel fair. And so then we get caught in that loop. But basically all of it is you could either describe it as we kind of fall into a victimized role or into a passive, sometimes even passive aggressive role. But we're not showing up in the driver's seat of our lives. We're kind of expecting somebody else to do it for us or to fix it for us. Or we just go, well, what's the point? I can't, I can't, I'm not able. I don't have any power. I can't make a change. Yes, you can make a change, but you have to be willing to take self-responsibility and show up as an adult, because the adult can create change. The child can't, but the adult can. So this is a huge part of this process, is we have to be willing to fully engage and to show up as adults who can take care of our inner child, so that the inner child no longer feels alone, abandoned, rejected, like she or he needs to be included. And this is why I say you can't get rid of parts of yourself, because that's just rejecting and abandoning yourself. We include, we embrace, we hold, we love, we sit with, we listen. So on a practical level, dealing with the shadow is every single day. You start to notice, well, how am I talking to myself? What is the voice of my critic? Where do I judge myself? Where do I blame and shame myself? What are the excuses that I'm making? Like all of these things, when you notice what is the pattern of how you're speaking to yourself and how you're reacting to yourself or to your life experiences, you start to look at it with awareness. And really the key here is curiosity, not judgment, but curiosity, because judgment, that's a whole other topic. Judgment keeps us stuck in our tracks. We can't grow. We can't move forward in a state of judgment. It's impossible. Judgment actually wants you to stay small. And also judgment just needs love as well, right? Because the judgment is just the critic that feels like it's not good enough. So you start to become aware of your pattern of how you're communicating with yourself and how you get triggered and how you respond to things, and what is the narrative, what's the story, what's the beliefs that go with that story. You start to map this all out. And then it's really about cultivating a relationship with this part of you that is compassionate and kind and attentive. You start to stay with your experiences rather than trying to numb and distract them or transcend them. You stay with them and you get curious. Why? Why am I saying this to myself? Why do I feel this way about myself? Where is this coming from? What is this part of me needing? And eventually it becomes something that kind of actually just requires repetition. You might understand quite quickly, and if you don't, this is where it's really useful to work with someone that can help. How I describe my work is I'm being the guide that is basically just holding a light up to these things so that you can see them for yourselves and understand them for yourself. And then we work on, okay, what does this part of you need so that you can move forward? This is why it's not great to just sit in analysis, because you'll just go, okay, I know why this is going on, but there's no forward movement. The forward movement is taking the action to show up differently for yourself as an adult. Taking full self-responsibility and going like, nobody's going to come in and give me the degree of love that I needed from my mother and my father, but they weren't capable of giving it to me. No one is going to give me that to the degree that I need other than myself. That might be a hard truth. It doesn't mean you can't be loved by other people, but it's only going to go so deep. It's only going to go skin deep until you really feel it from the inside out. And the act of self-love, or being in a state of self-love, is you accept the parts that you don't like. In this moment, you're not going to like them. In this moment, you might resist them. In this moment, you might like squirm like crazy in your body going, I don't want to fucking look at this. But I'm telling you, you will feel relief when you do, because all these parts of us want is to be seen, to be heard, to be understood, to be loved. So begin to be aware, begin to walk towards yourself, begin to see if you can include these parts rather than reject and compartmentalize and try to get rid of them. Include them. Start to get curious as to why they're there. What are they telling you? All of your emotions are messengers. They're a language of your deeper inner being that are trying to get your attention and for you to understand, well, who am I? Why do I feel this way? What am I needing? What scares me? What makes me feel deeply vulnerable? What would make me feel safe? There's so much more that I could say on this topic, but this is long enough. This is probably one of my longest podcasts, and you could see because the conversation could go so deep. So I might do a part 2 to this. If you have any questions, anything that you'd want me to flesh out more, I would love to get your comments. You can reach me directly and tell me your questions. And I will answer them in maybe a part 2 to this podcast. And as always, take it or leave it as feels right for you. Sit with it, come up with your own thoughts and answers to this. Like, so much of this process is about building inner trust and inner knowing, which is there. You just might have been disconnected from it or forgotten it, or you might have never actually been supported in that. And I think the time that we're in right now is really cultivating that relationship with ourselves where we trust our inner knowing. The answers are always within us. We can receive external support, but ultimately the answers are always within us. We've just been taught not to trust ourselves. We've been taught to listen to outer external authority and experts, and I believe that that's really disempowering at the end of the day. So don't even fully listen to me. Take it in, but sit with it and make it your own version. What resonates, take it. What doesn't resonate, transform it into whatever version can support you. Not to support your illusion, but to really support your authenticity, right? And to find really what you want to step into is your own self-empowerment, which is really just comes from trusting yourself. And trusting yourself comes from showing up for yourself again and again and again with love, compassion, and understanding. All right, y'all. Thank you for listening. Loving you from afar. You've been listening to Raw Conversations with Corinne Blum. Thanks so much for showing up, listening in, and being a part of the conversation with me.